find ourselves in the 17th century under a man called Sabbatai Zevi, who spawned what was the largest messianic movement in the last 2,000 years among the Jews. I mean, he was massive. It was a very messianic century. Because the year 1666 was on its way, the Christians thought Jesus was coming back, and there was a particular date which was auspicious in the Jewish calendar, where a lot of people thought it may be the date of the return of the Messiah. And this guy, Sabbatai Zevi, he was alive at that time. He was a renowned Kabbalist. You know, we said that these people focused very much on the Talmud, and a part of the Talmud specifically, Kabbalah. And the Kabbalah was a general set of rules that used to be there, and different rabbis and great scholars, sages among the Jewish population would come out with their own versions of it. And one man, in the middle of the 16th century, produced a version of Kabbalah which has spawned the entire Jewish messianic movement for the last 400 years.
And you said 1666 was the Christian year that they all thought they were going to see a return, and the Jews had their own specific Jewish date that kind of coincided with some messianic prophecy that they would bring forward a Messiah. And didn't they say that Sabbatai Zevi was the Messiah for a while?
Well, the Sabbatai Zevi was a follower of the Kabbalah of this particular type of Kabbalah. This is the one which has brought all messianic movements through Judaism, and it's known as the Lurian Kabbalah, after Isaac ben Solomon Luria. And this man invented a twist, a spin on the Kabbalah, a new interpretation and a new way of putting it together, and some new practices, spiritual practices. He was known among the community, by the way, as the Sacred Lion, because he was apparently able to do conjuring tricks, magic tricks with whatever he'd learnt, or he appeared to the people to have special powers, and it influenced them. And I'll give you a quote about this man now from the Encyclopedia Judaica. It says of the Lurian Kabbalah, in no small measure it prepared the ground for the messianic ferment of the Sabbatean movement. So you can't get a better authority than that. And it's saying this Kabbalah, not the Kabbalah that you go and buy down at the bookstore, but this particular one is the one where all the magic tricks, all the conjuring appears from. This version of the Kabbalah. And what happened was that Sabbatai Zevi was just like any other rabbi in that area of the world, about 50 to 70 years now after the time of Isaac ben Solomon. Isaac ben Solomon wouldn't allow anybody to teach his version of the Kabbalah while he was alive. After he died, he gave permission to his disciples and students who got to a certain stage to teach other people. So it was in limited form. What happened with the Sabbatean movement, Sabbatai Zevi, he started having visions. He was practicing this system and he started having visions. He started being able to do conjuring tricks himself. Other people who were practicing the same thing as him started to have visions about Sabbatai Zevi being the Messiah. And these guys were great rabbis and spiritual leaders in the community, and they were all having these dreams and visions about him. So it was very much adding to the fervor of the time. And he himself, they say that he didn't believe it to start with and came to believe. I mean, the man is, again, one of these things that is whitewashed. You know, they try to say, oh, it wasn't really that important and he was just an embarrassment in the history of Judaism. Let me tell you this now, at the height of his movement, he had 1 million Jews following him.
That's a big following.
In those days, 1 million Jews, mainly Ashkenazim, but even Sephardim, and because they thought he was going to be the Messiah and they'd been following him for almost 20 years, he got them all practicing this new Kabbalistic system. This is what he got all of his disciples, the ones who followed him and believed he was the Messiah, he got them all practicing this en masse. So we've got this enormous change from, the Judaism that everybody knew into, hey, this guy is, probably the next Messiah, and we're just waiting for it all to happen and for, light to break out of the sky. And what happens? He goes to Jerusalem at the height of his popularity to try and gain official blessing from the chief Sephardic rabbis who were still in Jerusalem. They were so frightened by him, his presence and the size of his movement and everything like that, and they said, we will not recognize you. We refuse to recognize you as the Messiah. And in fact, if you stay in Jerusalem, we will excommunicate you from the community. So he knew basically, he was being told by the Sephardi at this stage, we're not accepting you, go home. If you want to have a showdown on this one, we'll give you a showdown. And they were not convinced about him. And he was very disappointed. He left, he was only in Jerusalem for like a week, and he left very bitter, very angry at the way he'd been treated by them. But he still had his movement following him, and he was returning actually to Turkey to meet with various of his followers. And the Caliph of the day was very worried. The Turkish Caliph was not happy about the size of the movement and the way that people were thinking this man was the Messiah and the influence that he had as a result. So the Caliph actually had him arrested. This is a very important part of his history.
Right.
And he was given at sword point an ultimatum, which is you can become a Muslim or die. And he chose to become Muslim.
And so that proved to his followers that he didn't have the juice that he said he had.
This is the political ploy of the Caliph, was, that if I can spread it round like wildfire, send the messengers out that this man's become Muslim, then he'll lose all his following. And that was the hope of the Caliph. But and this is what a lot of Orthodox Jews or members of the Jewish community might even try to tell you, that the story ends there. But that's far, far from the truth. The story nowhere near ends there. What happened was that he left. He told his followers, don't worry, this isn't a genuine conversion. I was given no choice. He finished before he actually disappeared. Nobody truly knows his place of death. It's speculated. But he was put in exile to Albania with 100 followers, and they all went back to their Talmudic and Kabbalistic Judaism.
Right.
So his followers took hope in the fact that he himself had embraced embraced Islam, but had left it behind, and it had never been a sincere conversion. It was done under compulsion, and this basically gave permission. He said to all of his followers, listen, you can embrace whatever faith you want so long as you practice this in secret. And the whole Sabbatean movement, these million people, yes, he did lose some followers, but it went underground, Darrell, and this is what's critical for people to understand. This movement became a secret movement. It was not allowed to practice in front of the Caliphate. It was not allowed to practice in front of all the other Jews. It reached a stage among Sabbateans that even their children were not told the religion of their household until they had come of age. They would reach 11, 12, 13 years of age, and then they would teach the children the faith. That way their children could play with other children, and they had no fear that their children might tell somebody at school or their friends they were playing with, oh, my dad believes this, or my mum does that, you see. They hid it even from their own children. Now, the Sabbatean movement a large number of people in Turkey actually, like him, followed his example and embraced Islam, and they're known today as the Donme Jews of Turkey. Anybody who goes and looks at these people would think that they were just normal Turkish Muslims, and this again is proof of Ashkenazi and ethnicity. The Donme Jews do not look different to anybody else. The Donme started in the 17th century. The Donme are still there to this day in Turkey. They have survived 250 years. They are known as the wife-swapping Jews of Turkey.
And they also were where the Young Turks movement was born, where many Armenians still believe the Turks in general were the reason why they were slaughtered wholesale. But the fact is, today we understand they were what we call today crypto Jews, which are this group you're discussing now, got themselves ensconced into the highest levels and actually helped perpetrate that genocide.
Indeed, Darrell, this is the crux of the matter. The beliefs of the Lurian Kabbalah and the practice of the Sabbatean movement is the start of Crypto-Judaism. The Crypto-Jew and Crypto-Judaism. Crypto-Judaism, tell everybody you believe one thing, really you practice another and believe another. Crypto-Jew, tell everybody you're a Muslim, really you're a Jew. Tell everybody you're a Christian, really you're a Jew. And you can do this as far as they were concerned. It was part of the teachings of the Messiah, Sabbatai Zevi. So as far as they're concerned, the Messiah himself has given them not only permission but instruction to start behaving like this. The Donme were used at the time when they needed to overthrow the Caliph, to prepare the way for the First World War and the establishment of the Jewish national homeland in Palestine, Zionism. That's when the Jews actually went back and did a deal with the Donme and said, and by this, and I'm using the term Jews loosely here because, as you'll see, if you study the history, you'll see they were Sabbateans. Another group of Sabbateans went to them and said, we need you to organize a movement. They were living in Salonika at that time. They said, go into Turkey and overthrow the Caliph. And they went in there and they established Freemasonic lodges, the first Freemasonic lodges in Turkey. And operating through those lodges over a period of time, they were able to overthrow the Turkish Caliphate.
Now, the Masonic lodges you're discussing, we're going to go to this now because I want to bring up what started now after Sabbatai Zevi's original failure. His movement actually morphed into several others, and one of them was, and it says so on a site that I read about it, that it ended up morphing into the Frankist movement, didn't it?
Jacob Frank himself said, Sabbatai Zevi was Messiah, and I myself am Messiah, and all three of us are manifestations of God himself. So, to get the timing here, Frank died in 1791, okay? That's when he died. And bear in mind that Isaac ben Solomon was pushing his Lurial Kabbalah around in around the 1560s. So we can see there that when people try to tell us this movement died with Sabbatai Zevi, it's entirely untrue. Because now, today, these people who built up a following of very wealthy Jews and powerful Jews, bankers and such like, by saying, don't worry, we're not extremists and you don't have to swap your wife with anybody, and because they're involved in orgiastic wife swapping and all sorts of strange practices, the Sabbateans. They said, look, you don't have to worry about that. With us, you can just practice normal Judaism and we'll give you this particular spin.
We know that a large fortune was passed on from father to son, and it actually started back in the 14th and 15th centuries. I mean, huge fortunes, and it actually was the seed money for fortunes such as Warburg and fortunes such as Rothschild. How does that fit into this story?
Well, what we have as part of the Sabbatean movement, we find that under Frank, towards the end of his life, he instructed his disciples to go to Poland, Warsaw in fact, and to build factories. and to get established in business and to start making big money. And also, according to Encyclopedia Judaica again, his followers became active in the Masonic organizations in Poland too. The Sabbatean movement is very, very deep, and these were openly Frankist in their beliefs, again involved in all the orgiastic wife swapping and all the other strange practices that they have. Which most Jews would say, oh, all of this stopped with the Sabbatean movement under Sabbatai Zevi. But we can actually demonstrate that this was still being practiced in the middle of the 19th century, and even the early 20th century, they were still visible. Now, the other thing about Jacob Frank, is that is the man who told Adam Weishaupt to found the Illuminati, the Bavarian Illuminati.
Now, at this time, 1790, the Rothschilds were already well established as nation crushers, and they had already backed the Jacobins in their revolt against the king of France. They had already begun with dealings with Cromwell and the rest. I mean, how was their activity monitored by these people, and where did they come in with all this money?
Okay, well, Adam Weishaupt took his money from Rothschilds in founding the Illuminati in Bavaria. He was financed by the Rothschild, but the instruction came from Jacob Frank himself. So,
now, the Rothschilds had already been rich for a generation already, and I mean, were they handed their fortune, or did they build it themselves, or was it a mix of both? Or, I mean, who gave them their start over in Frankfurt and Hanover?
Their start came through the history of them coming from families which were involved in the financing of trade. They were always involved in trade finance, which goes back, all the way to the very early days of the settlements, where people were traveling through the middle of the Khazaria, coming in and out. It was the Jews who were present in Khazaria at that time, before their embracing Judaism, were the ones who financed the business. They put money up because, of course, the Jews were money lenders of old. Because they could charge interest on it. The Muslims didn't lend on interest, and the Christians wouldn't lend on interest, but the Jews would, you see. So they were prepared to risk their money on a loan to finance transactions. And so mainly from money lending is how, and trade finance is the way that the Rothschilds began to build their fortune. Of course, he made a fortune out of the Battle of Waterloo. I don't know if you know that.
Yes, story. I do. I know they imploded the stock market and then bought it all back at pennies on the pound.
Indeed, they sent a false messenger into the London Stock Exchange. In today's day and age, you would go to jail for doing this, of course. But they sent a messenger in saying that the British had lost the Battle of Waterloo. The stock market plummeted. He bought everything up for pennies. And then the real messengers arrived and said that they'd won, and the stock exchange went up and he sold it all for cash, which he swapped in for gold. That was just, I mean, if you have people who are prepared to cheat, then and steal from people and defraud people, then you can probably be quite successful in this world. And the thing about the Kabbalah is that it does say that there is no such thing as evil. These people have a belief that says evil is in the mind of the Gentile. Mm-hmm. And it's only because of their lack of spiritual enlightenment that they believe that people are evil or that evil exists. But if they were of a better mind, they would not see these things as evil. It comes down to these teachings from Kabbalah, which says that in this world there is no evil, or it even says in another slightly different spin on the same thing. It says the evil in the world is there from the left hand of God, and because God has a left hand where all evil comes from, if we work evil in the world, we are doing God's work in the world. We are working His left hand. This is absolutely true. Anybody can study the Kabbalah and they will find that these are core teachings, fundamental, not extreme to one side. These are very, very central to the core, because they say God is infinite, without personality, and therefore evil exists, and they use the Kabbalah as the basis for understanding evil in the world, and they say it exists, but it's not really evil. and specifically the Lurian Kabbalah. And you'll find that these people believe the same thing throughout time.
Shabtai Tzvi should be known to every Jew. He really should be in Jewish history something unique and huge, because more than half the Jews of the world thought he was the Messiah. And they did incredibly stupid things in the days of redemption. This was in the 1660s, when he declared that he was the Messiah of the Jews, and he ordered the Jews to blaspheme the Torah. That's putting it mildly. What he decided was that debauchery was theology. That every word of the Torah is true in the opposite sense. That means 613 mitzvot were all sins. And all the sins became mitzvot. And, well, let's take a simple example. Do not kill became do kill. Do not adulter became do adulter. Purim was his favorite holiday. That was the annual wife swappers holiday. It was called Extinguishing the Lights. And by his order, the Jews swapped wives. All over the world, this was not a local phenomenon. Now, all the books say the same thing, that Shabtai Tzvi gained prominence from Iran to Mexico. All over the world, the Messiah was going to come, and he announced the date. And this date, by the way, is significant because it shows he had Christian backers, theologians behind him. He declared he was the Messiah on June 18th of 1666. June, of course, is the 6th month. 18 is 6 times 3, and we don't have to, well, 666 is obvious enough. And on that day, all of a sudden, it was the time of redemption. And the Jews could do anything they wanted. You know his prayer, the prayer that the Jews quoted were, "Blessed be he who permits the forbidden." That was the actual Sabbatean prayer. And the Jews went through an orgy worldwide of, again, the Christians would call it Satanism. But it was certainly he changed Judaism in the worst possible way. Now, I'm not sure if you understand that Shabtai Tzvi did not die. Now, this is the real issue and the real problem, is that the Sultan of Turkey said enough of Shabtai Tzvi. This was in September of 1666. All over the world, they were coming to his court. Go and look up Shabtai Tzvi in a book of Jewish history. Where did he go? He was the most influential rabbi in modern times, and he has been rubbed out of the history books. Keep that in mind. You can't find that much of Shabtai Tzvi. But the Sultan of Turkey said, enough, you have to convert to Islam. And Shabtai Tzvi, now there are conflicting reports, but he apparently, without any resistance, took off his kippah and put on a turban, and the next thing you know, he was a Muslim. And most Jews worldwide abandoned Shabtai Tzvi, and they were very, very upset. You know, you have to realize what they did leading up to the day that he announced he was the Messiah. They stripped their houses of roofs because they thought they were going to be transported magically to Jerusalem. They buried themselves up to their necks in. This was, you know, in Europe leading up to June. It's awfully cold to be buried in the ground, getting punishment. They would flagellate. They would throw themselves into the Mediterranean, the icy waters. The Jews went nuts. Worldwide, they went nuts. And that's what's happening to Israel today. Israel is going nuts. and I'm trying to explain where it's coming from, and the Israelis just think, darn, we got the worst leaders anywhere. They just lie. They don't stop lying. You can't trust them. Israel is going nuts. And you're going to see slowly how this came to be. Call it an alternative retelling of Jewish history, because it really is. When Shabtai Tzvi converted to Islam, most Jews abandoned, but not all. There was a sect in Turkey called the Dhamma, who decided that this was, in fact, a magical pronouncement by Shabtai Tzvi that we should all convert to other religions, but secretly practice Sabbateanism. Turkey is run by the Sabbateans, and we'll get to that shortly. But what can I say? Jacob Frank. Jacob Frank was Europe's second Messiah. That's what he was called. The second Messiah of the Jew was Jacob Frank. And he worked from 1750, died in 1791, born in 1726. Yeah, those are about the right dates. What he did was he convinced the bishop of his diocese that his people were not Jews, they were anti-Talmudists. And the bishop bought it. And he ordered all the Talmuds of the diocese burnt. And then he said, I'll bring you lots and lots of new Catholics. He brought him 5,000 to be mass converted to Catholicism. I believe the year was 1859. 1759. All of a sudden, Europe's Jews, by the many thousands, were becoming Catholic publicly. They despised Catholicism, but privately, they were Sabbatean. And as fantastic as it seems, there really, really are conspiracies of silence. If the rules are you don't open your mouth, you don't open your mouth, they exist. The Sabbateans didn't just exist as a tiny little cult. They were being converted by the thousands in the 18th century. Oh, by the way, just to let you know about Jacob Frank and what it was to be a Jew, it wasn't all just clandestine cells and subterfuge. You got so much fun. The purification of the soul was sex orgies. Frank expanded Shabtai Tzvi. Now it's history. He's a big boy. What am I going to say? I can't. The purification of the soul was very anti-Jewish. It was a very bad thing. There, to qualify this, he expanded Shabtai Tzvi into really a cult. And it was no different than a cult today where you control the minds of people through sex. Just leave it at that. Okay, last word I say on it. Now, something happened. Oh, and by the way, I want to add something before I forget it. This is like an off-the-cuff lecture. The first Zionists, last word on wife swapping, that stuff. Last word. The first Zionists and their kibbutz scene, that's all it was. Without going into the depths of who Golda Meir was and what her early life was, and this and that, that's what the first Zionists were. They were Sabbatean, I'm leading to that. They actually were Sabbatean. And they participated in this stuff. They used the word secular. That's the word they used. They were seculars. This is beyond secular. Secular to me is not being affiliated with any religious group. This is beyond that, but they were called secular. Chiloni, in Hebrew from the Greek Hellenistic, is what they called themselves, and they were proud of it. And their goal was to turn Israelis into Chilonim. They hated the religious. Let me not kid you how much the labor Zionists hated the religious. But let's go into our little story how it got that way. Jacob Frank ran out of money in the year 1785 or so. This is when the Sabbateans made, well, a pact with the big devils. Suddenly, Jacob Frank got very rich in 1786. He moved his sect to Offenbach, a suburb of Frankfurt. Frankfurt was also the home of Mayor Amschel Rothschild and the home of someone named Adam Weishaupt. Little by little, for those unacquainted with this piece of history, the Rothschilds are the Sabbateans of the world. And here is why. There was a meeting that took place apparently in Rothschild's humble home then. In 1786, he was not all that wealthy. He was a coin dealer. His sons made him wealthy. His 5 sons expanded a business. The business was to control the economies of nations and thus control the nations. He found a magnificent formula. If we can get hold of the nations' economies, we've got the nations. He sat with Jacob Frank, who wanted the Jews to become non-Jews. He wanted them to become Sabbateans. He wanted them to accept the real Messiah of the Jews, Shabtai Tzvi, and incidentally, and the second Messiah, Jacob Frank. That's one of this little 3-pointed triangle. That's one point. Adam Weishaupt was the founder of something called the Illuminati.
Favor, please. Don't speak about the Illuminati, because the Illuminati is considered one of these things where the Jews are taking over the world.
No, let me go on. I can't change what is the fact. No.
This is not true.
No, I'm not. All right, questions at the end, and that's that. You have to deal with facts, and they're not nice facts. What they did, quite simply, was they had to overturn the existing societies. And unfortunately for us Jews, they did a real job. Now let me tell you that all of this was banned. Now the story in all the history books is the same thing, that there was, just before the French Revolution, a horseman fell. In his satchel were the plans for the revolution. In the satchel were the plans for the Illuminati and so forth. It was all banned. Throughout Europe, it was banned. And that put Weishaupt, that put Rothschild, and to a lesser degree, Frank into a problem. What do you do if you're banned? And they came up with something that has changed history for good. Weishaupt said, well, what we do is we take our tenants and we put them into an organization that has lodges and chapters worldwide, and we subvert the existing organization to our tenants. And the organization they chose was British Freemasonry. Now, there was no such thing as a Freemasonic conspiracy before the 18th century. As far as I can tell, they were very nice. They were a builders' guild. They backed builders throughout Europe, and they were all right. All of a sudden, there are revolutions. All of a sudden, you have something you never saw before, ever. You actually saw talk of one organization upending whole nations. Now, here's where the Jews fit in, and this is the scary part. You now have a new world. Germany is Sabbateanism. That is where it began. Turkey is the Don. That's the home of Shabtai Tzvi. It's a major player, but it's now being shifted. The real players from here on in were Germany first, and then London, where there was freedom to expand on their ideas. So suddenly you had Jews who were no longer Jews. Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels. They moved from Germany to London. From London, their ideas spread all over the world. In America, Solomon Schechter, the Reform movement. It's all the same. Germany to London, where it spreads to America. All of this, all of a sudden, the Jews have got an enlightenment. Moses Mendelssohn, he wasn't a Jew. He was born a Jew, but he converted. And his children converted. all for the enlightenment of the Jews. One after another, the Jews were being diluted. They were being whittled down. By the way, the situation that I've seen in America is that worked like a charm. I'm telling you, you want to talk about whittled down Jews. This country is really, except for the Orthodox, really lost its Jewish thinking and heritage. And that again, Germany, Solomon Shepherd, to London. He gets the money, he gets the packing, he goes to America. Now, we've got the world's greatest, and this scares Jews. Believe me, I'm not blind to this. I'm very aware of this. There's a new history. It's not a new history, it's an old history being retold. But you have to look, and you can't ignore a really serious problem, is that the Rothschilds took on America. And all of the following names are simply not Jewish. Within one generation, they stopped being Jewish. But from Frankfurt, Germany, the Rothschilds sent John Jacob Astor, Jacob Schiff, Max Warburg. He sent all of his agents to America to corrupt the robber barons, essentially. If you were very, very successful, they made a deal with you. You promote our thinking, and our thinking is the end of Jews. It really, really was a war against the Jews in a very different way that people understand. And it becomes harsh from here on in. We're now in the 19th century, and that was not a good century for the Jews. That was the century of the pogroms. What you have now with America is try and find a Jewish Astor anymore. Try and find a Jewish Schiff. John Jacob Schiff's grandson is married to Al Gore's daughter. This is true blue Sabbateanism. We'll get to that. It's all over the place. It's terrifying. And we'll get to that. They're not Jews anymore. But they are affecting Jews. They want Jews to be something else. Now you've got, I find this a terrifying thing. You got the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Carnegies, the Harrimans. They were all given European money. America was not all that rich in the 19th century. You had people building railroads, you had them putting up steel mills, but the money was in Europe. And it was in the hands largely of the Rothschilds. They agreed for ideological purposes that if you play our game, we'll give you power you've never had before. And this is how non-Jews started doing the work of the Sabbateans. And I have to be very, very easy on this. Very easy on this. The fact of the matter is, in the 1870s, the Sabbateans of England decided on something new. The Jews weren't cooperating. They were not changing their point of view. They were not accepting Shabtai's fee. They liked their religion. And I got to remind you of something very important. Until the rise of Sabbateanism, secretly, the Jews loved being Jews. It was as natural as breathing. There were no self-hating Jews. After Sabbateanism hit, the Jews started despising themselves. This was also done on purpose. But the point is, in Britain, something called the British Israelites emerged. They actually thought that the British were Israelites. And I've read their stuff. It's weird stuff. In the Roman times, the tribe of Dan landed in England, and London is named from the tribe of Dan, and I've read their stuff. And it's wacky. But nonetheless, they figured out the ultimate plan to get the Jews to be Sabbateans. They're going to take back Israel. They developed Zionism. In the 1870s, they developed a perfect plan to get the Jews back to where they wanted the Jews to be. They developed Zionism. And the idea was to make life so miserable for the Jews of Europe that they would come to Eretz Israel. The Jews did escape Europe, but they went to America. That was the problem. 2 million of them escaped Europe due to the pogroms. My grandparents included. But they did not go to Eretz Israel. The first Aliyah was in 1880. A few went to Eretz Israel. The Rothschilds built Rishon LeZion. They built the first city in Israel. They got the ball rolling, but it was a lousy place to go. There was nothing there. There were a bunch of bandits and a bunch of malaria, and it just was not a good place to settle. So now I'm going to jump ahead before jumping back. Eventually this was solved by someone named Colonel Edward House. He was Woodrow Wilson's, well, he was Woodrow Wilson. What he did is put restrictions on him, grave restrictions on immigration to the United States. And the Jews no longer had that option after 1919, I believe. But let's go to this real problem, and here is Zionism now. Folks, this is going to probably be a little shocking. In 1898, Theodor Herzl met Kaiser Wilhelm in Jerusalem. Now, if you think that Jerusalem was a good place to go on a holiday in 1898, you don't know how bad it really was. Jerusalem, in fact, was a rotten place. There were no roads. You took the Kaiser didn't take a tramp steamer, everyone else did. You went up skinny little roads, there were no hotels. It was disease-ridden, you couldn't get a decent meal, and yet the most powerful leader of Europe came to Israel to put up 3 churches, one a very big church, the church of the Dormition Abbey, the church of the Dormition. On November 2nd of 1898, in Jerusalem, he met the father of Zionism, Theodor Herzl. Why would Herzl make that awful trip to Jerusalem to meet Kaiser Wilhelm? There was only one answer. He wanted a state. That's the only answer. And if you go on the internet, because this has been the most important meeting of modern Zionism, Herzl meets the Kaiser of Germany in Jerusalem. Try and find it on the internet. It's been rubbed out. And the few sources that I got said all the same thing. Herzl was rebuffed. Rebuffed from what? What did the Kaiser do to rebuff Herzl? And the answer is, he said, no, you're not going to get a state. We are not going to go to war with Turkey and give you a Jewish state because we have made an alliance with Turkey. And they permitted us to put up a church on the highest point in Jerusalem. I have a picture of it. Afterwards, take a look at the Dormition Abbey, and you'll see that Germany and Turkey formed an alliance. And Theodor Herzl changed. Now, I've read about Herzl. He was not a Sabbatean. Herzl was just a charismatic guy who could gather people around him. He was a good guy. In 1901, Theodor Herzl met the British Zionists who wanted Britain, not Germany, to get the Jewish state. And Theodor Herzl said, forget it. We cannot have a state in the ancient land of Israel. We would have to fight the Turkish-German alliance. It would kill millions upon millions of people. We can't do it. It's not worth it. He said to the British, you have land in Africa. Just give us Uganda. It'll do. We'll live with it. And this would have ruined the Sabbatean plan. It would have destroyed the plan of the Sabbateans. The only way to get the Jews to become a different people was to have Eretz Israel back, not Uganda. Uganda wouldn't have done the trick. And anyways, we'd be Rhodesia today. You know, I mean, it wouldn't have worked anyways. So now here and I warn you ahead of time, it's not easy speech, but nonetheless I'm going to say it. Theodor Herzl went at the age of 44 into a sanatorium in Paris shortly after this little announcement. For a disease, go and look every which way and find out what was wrong with Herzl. I sure couldn't. And he died after 2 weeks in the sanatorium. Now, when I was growing up, this is what they told me. My parents, my Hebrew school teachers, they all told me the same thing. That darn Herzl worked so darn hard that his heart stopped. Yeah, sure he did. He died at 44. Even in 1905, you just didn't drop dead at 44 because your heart stopped. He was murdered. And this was the first of the Zionist murders. You've now got a new leader of the Zionists. Now you have to, there was a little gap where someone named Wolfenson took over the World Zionist Organization, or what became known in Israel as the Jewish Agency. But then you got yourself a bad one. You got yourself a really, really dreadful, mass murdering head of the Jewish Agency, Chaim Weizmann. And when you got Weizmann in power, you got the Jews really in a lot of trouble. Now I'm going to give you one example, and then just to make it easier, and then we'll go backwards. 1936, World Zionist Conference, Basel, Switzerland. Weizmann was applauded, no less, for saying in the upcoming Holocaust, he used the word Holocaust, there may not be 2 million surviving Jews, but they will be strong and good for Eretz Israel. We're going to talk about the connivance very shortly of the labor Zionists with the Nazis. And it's not a nice story. Weizmann knew a Holocaust was coming. It was planned. And by the way, a third of my family died in the Holocaust. I want you to know that. Thanks to my grandfather and me digging through old records and Yad Vashem and stuff, I found a third of my family were wiped out. So don't think I'm not taking this personally. I'm taking this plenty personally. My children live in Israel. I only left there because I was almost killed there, and it's a different story. Folks, I'm going to test your maturity now. All right? And I'm not kidding when I say this. You are amongst the privileged who are going to hear this. I give this to Goyish crowds, and they are big crowds, and they accept this. Jews have a different problem. They don't want to accept it. Chaim Weizmann was a butcher. His name should be taken off every university and technical institution, everything. Wipe the name off. In 1908, a Sabbatean named Atatürk took over Turkey. And go on the internet and write Atatürk Sabbatean or Atatürk Jew, and you are going to be very surprised how much Hebrew this man knew. The Young Turks, the Donma, took over Turkey. Through their little Masonic lodges, Turkey was now taken over by the Sabbateans. Stage 1 done. Stage 2, let's practice a Holocaust. They murdered 1.5 million Armenians during World War I. This was a dry run for the big one. And today, by the way, I'm not going to go how the American Jewish leadership made darn sure the Jews of Europe just died, led by Rabbi Stuart Wise. And I have a separate lecture on that mess. That not one Jewish organization, except the Orthodox rabbis, again, except for the Orthodox rabbis, not one Jewish organization tried to stop the Holocaust. Not a one. Where the hell were the Jews? A third of my family, and I'm sure you have very similar stories. We have now got to this. I'm going to bring us up to date, and up to date. I'm going to bring you to the year 1932. Skipping a lot of stuff, we'll just keep this on topic. In 1932, 250 plus organizations represented German Jewry. 250 plus. In 1934, 1. labor Zionism. All the rest were wiped out, and only one was left, labor Zionism. Labor Zionism were allowed to keep camps to indoctrinate German Jewry into Sabbateanism before they would be shipped to Palestine. Practically all the Jews who came to Israel in the 30s were German. 70,000 of them. The reason why was the transfer agreement. Go on buy my book, it'll be dirt cheap. Otherwise, go on the internet, look up the transfer agreement. What an agreement. And this was the end of Zev Jabotinsky and the Peru Party as well. The transfer agreement stated it was an agreement between the Jewish Agency of Jerusalem and the Nazi Party. And it was signed and it went into effect. The Jewish Agency would allow Germany to make life so miserable for the Jews that they would come to their indoctrination camps where the weak would be weeded out, eventually to be killed in camps, and the strong would be sent to Israel. In return for which, the Jewish Agency of Jerusalem would make sure that every immigrant used his funds to buy German goods, propping up the economy, would stop all protests, embargoes, anything against the Nazi regime. Worldwide, Jews in America were organizing parades against the Nazis. The word got out from the Zionists in Israel, leave the Nazis alone. During the Holocaust, there was only one Jewish organization led by Chaim Weizmann who knew a Holocaust was coming, planned it with the Germans, and that was labor Zionism. Now, let me tell you something that's going to be shocking to you. And believe me, I believe that you are mature enough to accept this. It isn't easy for me. Do you think when I was researching this, I was having a good time? I mean, you have to understand, this is crappy work. It's just something that fell into my hands. I wasn't even meant to do this work. You know, until Rabin was murdered, I was the Israeli correspondent for the Hollywood Reporter and for Billboard magazine and Screen International. I was a trade journalist. Who even thought of this stuff? Now, with that in mind, that I was not looking for this, it just came to me. The idea of Israel was never to be a shelter for Jews. Never. No religious Jew was allowed in Israel all through the Holocaust. If he got in, it was through his doing. Nobody rescued any religious Jews. The only Jews allowed into Israel from 1933 until the White Paper of 1939 were German Jews. Did you know Winston Churchill's mother was a Jew? And that means that Churchill himself was Jenny Jacobson. Her father was a stockbroker from New York. Churchill was a Jew. He was a Sabbatean. Look, again, you have to look this up on the internet, who Jenny Jacobson was. Churchill was a Jew. He was another Benjamin Disraeli. It doesn't matter if they convert to, the Sabbateans convert and they mix. It's a very ugly, messy situation. Stalin. You think Stalin was a Jew? All three of his wives were Jews. All his children are Jews. This is Sabbateanism. This was a Sabbatean war. You know, I'm not being overly dramatic when I say this either. This was a war fought by the Sabbateans, and they are not Jews. Don't mix them up. They are the enemies of the Jews. Israel took the German Jews and used them for seed stock to get a new Judaism. They were going to wipe out the Jews, as many as they could, of Europe, and start a new Judaism in Israel based on Sabbateanism. Everyone thinks it's left-wing, that the problem is the left are crazy. It's not the left. The children of the left maybe never heard of Shaddai Tzvi. But in the ruling quarters, and in Israel that's not very many people, they know darn well who he was. The first president of Israel, Ben Tzvi, went to Turkey and became a true blue Sabbatean. Israel's founders were Sabbateans who went to Turkey to learn their stuff from the original Sabbateans. This is all true. It's all true. Israel was the worst thing that ever happened to the Jewish people was labor Zionism. Now, in Marvin Antolin's book, To Eliminate the Opiate, he calls the Holocaust, as the Sabbateans call the Holocaust, he calls it, oh my goodness, burning, what does he call it? Burnt offerings. Burnt offerings is the Sabbatean term for the killing of Jews. If you are a Jew who does not believe that Shaddai Tzvi was the Messiah, it is a mitzvah to kill you. They derive energy from this. This isn't properly understood, but it almost came out.
We're going to go back to Ben Friedman's work here. He talks about World War II, the destruction and all of the things that happened in World War II being designed in order to get an exodus of the Jewish community from Europe. In other words, there was no event that was going to get them to migrate to the Middle East, to Palestine, and that these people, these megalomaniacs in charge, came up with a scheme that by having this hatred generated against the Jewish community, somehow they would get an exodus of this community, and by and large it worked, didn't it?
Oh yes, in fact, Hitler was recruited by the World Zionist Organization in 1923. He had this whole movement in Germany wasn't going anywhere, and the World Zionist Organization cut a deal with him in 1923. They joined and worked together, and that's how the Nazi Party was created. So you see, the Holocaust itself was created entirely in the Jewish community. The rest of the world had no problem with Jewish people whatsoever.
Well, their goal, though, was to get a population of them to get back into Palestine and then to exercise that Balfour agreement they had made with the British, so that a homeland could be established. To what end was this being done? Why were they trying to set up this homeland, Eustace, in your view?
Well, they figured this homeland was at the crossroads of the world, and that it would control the entire world. That's what it was. It was a world of domination. They weren't just looking for a homeland for the Jewish people. They were looking to dominate the world. You could do it from the crossroads of the world in Palestine.
Hitler was financed. His war machine, his buildup, was financed by these bankers, wasn't it?
Oh yes, Max Warburg and Max Oppenheimer financed everything. All of his money came from Jewish bankers, which created the paradoxical situation that you had an anti-Semitic government which was attacking the Jews, and it was all financed with Jewish money.
Well, now at the time, was anybody aware was this above board, or was this kind of clandestine financing?
Oh, this was clandestine. In fact, I only came into it years later, after World War II. Religion is the perfect smokescreen, because you can say whatever you're doing for God, and who could criticize you for that?
Well, that seems to be what's happened then.
Oh yeah, exactly what happened.
Well, and I also understand that there are nonsensical ideas that they want to reestablish the Temple Mount after they've consolidated their power in the Middle East.
Oh, they certainly do. All those plans are in formation right now.
They are.
Oh yes.
And to reestablish that Temple Mount, to welcome the Rothschilds to the leadership role in that area?
Well, the Rothschilds had the leadership role there in 1880. The whole idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine was financed by the Rothschilds from Vienna in 1880. See, there was never a penny put up by the Jewish community itself for settling in Palestine, because the Jews were very happy in Europe. They had no reason to go to Palestine. If you're living in a beautiful modern city, why would you want to go live in a desert? I mean, they're not crazy. And the American people have no conceptions geopolitics whatsoever.
Yeah, that's pretty evident.
The Illuminati and Freemasons all came out of the Rothschilds in Vienna, Austria. In fact, the Rothschilds invented Zionism, fascism, Nazism, and communism, all in 1830 in Germany. And there's not a dime's worth of difference between any of them. And that was a declaration of war against Germany in 1933. So World War II was actually inaugurated by Samuel Adenauer in New York in 1933.
Yeah, that was the day that the war was actually declared, wasn't it, against the German people?
That was war. That was a declaration of war.
And both of them being financed, again, two sides of a war, being financed by the same megalomaniacs.
Oh, yes. Well, you cannot really have a war unless you finance both sides, because it's very hard to start wars. Most people don't want to go to war, and so therefore you have to finance two sides to get them to fight each other. Saddam Hussein was on the CIA payroll for 40 years, and the Bushes supported him all the way.
Now, who's in charge of America right now? I know George Bush and family are just underlings of these people.
Oh, yeah, they're lackeys. I used to tell people that the Rothschilds financed the Harrimans and the Union Pacific Railroad, and they financed John C. Rockefeller and Standard Oil, so they were just puppets of the Rothschilds.